When you write about Jekyll and Hyde in your exam, it's highly likely you will refer to Stevenson's theme of the dual nature of humans. It's a theme that has been explored from the very earliest reviews of the text. In 1886, Andrew Lang, writing in the Saturday Review, explained that Mr. Stevenson's idea, his secret, but a very open secret, is that of the double personality in every man. This theme certainly is an open secret. It doesn't take any sort of in-depth analysis to spot it. It's not subtle. Jekyll himself mentions it, and it's found in the contrasting descriptions of setting, as well as in Stevenson's use of contrasting language. However, one of the more subtle ways in which Stevenson presents his theme of duality is through his use of genre. The most obvious genre in which to place Jekyll and Hyde is that of Gothic fiction. Gothic tales often contain monsters, horror, death, nighttime settings, ominous weather, and inexplainable events. Of course, we see all of these in Stevenson's work, many of them numerous times. Let's just focus on nighttime setting and weather as an example. In Chapter 1, Enfield's Walk takes place at about 3 o'clock of a black winter morning. In Chapter 2, Utterson tosses and turns all night. In the same chapter, he finally meets Hyde after 10 p.m. Carew's murder takes place when a fog rolled over the city in the small hours, and on it goes, so we can safely say that Stevenson's novella fits the generic conventions of Gothic fiction. However, Jekyll and Hyde can also be seen as conforming to the generic conventions of a scientific case study, such as those published in Victorian Britain in Mind, a quarterly review of psychology and philosophy. In these kinds of publications, scientists would present case studies based on patients. Stevenson's full title, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, is reminiscent of a title from a scientific case study, but there's more to it than that. In her fascinating book, Popular Fiction and Brain Science in the Late 19th Century, Anne Stiles, writing about Jekyll and Hyde, points out how, despite its conformity to certain Gothic conventions, the novella succeeds in mimicking and critiquing the rational form of the case study through its seemingly dispassionate narrative voice. In Victorian scientific journals, the typical case study commences with an ostensibly objective third-person narrative written by one or more scientists, with anecdotal and numerical evidence and illustrations appended toward the end of the piece. Similarly, Stevenson's novella starts out with a third-person narrator writing mainly from the point of view of Utterson. The letters from Hasty Lanyon and Henry Jekyll at the end of the novella resemble the concrete data placed toward the end of the traditional 19th century case study. As Stiles points out then, the convention of opening with a seemingly dispassionate third-person narrative voice fits in perfectly with the first 8 chapters of Jekyll and Hyde, which are centred around the sober-minded lawyer Utterson. The point on structure also fits in with the genre. Have you ever wondered just why the text is structured as it is, with the third-person narrative focused on Utterson, followed by the first-person letter from Lanyon, and finally the first-person account from Jekyll himself? Well, here's one interpretation. It makes the book mimic the structure of a scientific case study, with the third-person narrative presented first, and then the concrete supplementary evidence presented at the end, almost as an appendix. Many of those reading the novella at the time it was published would have made this connection. So why does Stevenson do this? Well, a simple answer is that the novella is all the more terrifying for its readers if it contains a chilling air of realism. Stevenson achieves this sense of realism in a number of ways. For example, through setting the book in the Victorian London many readers at the time would know and recognise. But he also achieves it through mimicking the conventions of a scientific journal. However, if we see the novella as conforming to the generic conventions of both Gothic fiction and scientific research journal, there's an obvious conflict there. Stiles quotes Michal, who suggests that Gothic horror fiction has a generic obligation to evoke fear or suggest mystery, whereas science attempts to contain fear and offer a rational explanation for all phenomena. So, the Gothic and scientific genres are inherently opposed to each other, and here we begin to see the true genius of Stevenson's decision to mix these genres in the text. Stiles sums it up brilliantly. Stevenson did not merely reproduce the typical form of the case study, which was generally dry, unemotional, and detached from the patient's suffering. Stevenson combined the basic structure of the case study with a tone and subject matter more appropriate to the Gothic, so that his novella itself suffers from a case of split personality. So there it is. In a text which focuses on duality or split personalities, the novella itself has one in its usage of the dual opposing genres of Gothic fiction and scientific journal. It's a case of form reflecting content and is probably the most sophisticated way in which Stevenson presents his theme of the duality of humanity. Now you might be wondering, aren't multiple narratives just another convention of Gothic fiction? Well, they can be, but what we're looking at in Jekyll and Hyde is how the separate narratives are placed at the very end of the main story. In Frankenstein, for example, the text begins with Walton's letters to his sister, then moves to Frankenstein's narrative, the creature's story, Frankenstein's narrative, and back to Walton's letters. Dracula, another example of Gothic fiction, shifts from journals to letters and even a newspaper article. The point Anne Stiles is making is that starting with the main story, made up of a third-person, dispassionate narrative, then adding in this case 2 letters at the end, is exactly what we would find in scientific case studies.